Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Good Roads Podcast. I am Jared LeMay here with Thomas Barakat, and today we wrap up our introductions of speakers from the Good Roads Conference from this April 16th to the 19th. It's been a unique and quite frankly informative adventure, wouldn't you agree, Thomas?
I would, Jared. It's been great to kind of hear from some of the speakers we're going to have at our conference ahead of the conference. Not a spoiler, but it's just great to kind of hear some of these ideas and thoughts, and I look forward to kind of seeing this in person in a few weeks' time.
Yeah, let's us dip our toe in the water, so to speak, and see all the great things we're going to be seeing at the conference.
Exactly.
All right. And like I said, we're going to wrap it up today. So on today's episode, we're pleased to have Sunil Johal, the Vice President of Public Policy at the CSA Group, who are committed to advancing health and safety and protecting the environment. Sunil has a very impressive resume, including holding executive and policy roles at all levels of government. He was also the Policy Director at the University of Toronto's Mowat Centre and currently serves as the David and Ann Wilson Professor in Public Policy at Victoria College of University of Toronto. He's also a fellow at the Public Policy Forum and the Brookfield Institute. And just by reading this, making me feel grossly inadequate about my life decisions. Thanks for joining us on the Good Roads Podcast, Sunil. It's fantastic to have you here.
No, great. Thanks, Thomas and Jared, for having me on. Looking forward to the conversation and looking forward to the conference in a couple weeks as well. Beautiful,
beautiful. Okay, let's start things off nice, light, and easy. And can you tell us a little bit about the CSA Group and the Public Policy Center? From what I've known about the CSA Group, and I'm sort of outside the whole policy sector, is I see that on warning labels and things like that from toys and so on and so forth. I really didn't expect them to have a policy department, let alone this navigating complexity article that we'll be discussing later.
Yeah, that's where probably most people do know of CSA is they see that symbol on like their kids' hockey helmets or on electrical appliances to certify that something's kind of up to snuff and it's a safe product to use. So CSA has been around for over 100 years now, and the Public Policy Center is certainly a new initiative of the organization. So I think the idea behind this really was CSA is really committed to promoting health, safety, sustainability across the country. So there's a really strong public interest mission for the organization. And as we all know, I think one of the best ways of helping improve the public interest, protect the public interest is through public policy measures. So, I mean, obviously, historically, the organization's been focused on standards development. And those are really important tools for governments, for policymakers to protect people's safety, improve health, kind of efficiency, whatever goals you have. But I think the organization in the past couple of years has really been thinking about let's get a little more involved and engaged on the policy side of things. So they approached me, I guess, probably year and a half ago or so, and asked if I was interested in joining and setting up a new, essentially a think tank with the organization to focus on policy issues. And I'd worked with them a little bit in the past on some research papers when I was at the Mowat Center. So I thought, sounds like a great opportunity to kind of start something from scratch and with a really pretty broad mandate. So we're really looking at issues ranging from inclusive economic growth to environmental sustainability to health and well-being of Canadians to public sector innovation. So you mentioned the Navigating Complexity report. So that was the first report we put out back in September. And we put out 4 other reports since then on topics ranging from remote work to the circular economy. And we'll have a number of other papers coming out kind of in the spring, summer, and through next year. So it's been really exciting to start and kind of launch a new organization. We've been getting really good feedback from policymakers and kind of people interested in policy across the country in terms of providing them some practical yet also innovative advice on how we can all collectively work together on some of the tricky issues that the country's facing right now.
Fantastic. And we can get all those reports the same place we get the Navigating Complexity, right?
Yeah, so if you just kind of Google CSA Public Policy Center, you'll come to our homepage, and all the reports are there, free for download. So if you're interested in seeing what we've been up to, certainly check it out. Bookmark the page. I was gonna say, like, smash the subscribe button, but I've been watching too many car reviews on YouTube, I guess. So there is no subscribe button. You can come to the website
Well,
freely.
on our YouTube page, there's a subscribe button, so
Oh,
smash that and the
so
like
smash
button.
your subscribe button then. Perfect.
But no, I'm actually curious to read the remote work article. That seems really interesting and really topical.
Yeah, that just
So,
came out 2 or 3 weeks ago. So it's really kind of looking at like what are all the policy implications attached to remote work? I mean, a lot of those conversations have really been focused on specific employers, like, okay, we're compelling people to come back to the workplace or we're going fully remote and we're kind of making those decisions. But like what about the impacts on climate change? What about the impacts on productivity, innovation, housing affordability? Like there's a lot of kind of different pieces of our lives that remote work can uh, touch on and can kind of depending on how it's utilized and how we kind of shape it could be beneficial or could be harmful to certain groups. So that's what the report explores.
that's interesting. I'll find those and I'll put those in the show notes.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. Well, it's great to hear about the other reports, but I guess I should say the reason why we were initially interested in having you come speak at our event, Sunil, was the first report that you guys put out, navigating complexity, policy making for an evolving world. So for us and for our members, we've been hearing about the declining trust in public institutions, and the effect that has on decision makers, and what the policies that they have to kind of to make to navigate this new world. So that was the thinking behind having you come speak. Last year, we actually interestingly had somebody from Edelman Canada who talked about their the trust barometer and how the numbers have been kind of declining in different aspects. There's government, there's media, different institutions. So I saw this and I thought, oh wow, this looks really interesting. We've had Sunil at the conference before. One of the best policy minds, definitely in the province, if not in the country. Sunil, can you tell us a bit more about this first report put out by the new Public Policy Center at the CSA Group?
Yeah, absolutely. So really, we wanted to kind of launch with something that was kind of broad and taking a systems level view of what's happening in the country right now, kind of coming out of the pandemic, late pandemic. For all those policymakers, and I mean, kind of, I was with the city, I was with the federal government at various parts of the pandemic, so I mean, I kind of seen this firsthand. Like, people have just been really heads down in crisis mode, right? I mean, kind of lurching from crisis to crisis during the pandemic. And it's been really challenging for obvious reasons to kind of take a step back and think about, okay, like, where are we as a country? What are some of the medium and longer term issues we should be thinking about and starting to kind of shape some policies around. So that was the thinking about this report, is like, let's take that step back on behalf of policymakers who have been so busy at all levels of government, federal, provincial, municipal, and give them a chance to kind of take a breath, read the report, and maybe it'll kind of help clarify some thinking about where the country's going, where particular issues are going. So we really just thought this was an opportunity to kind of like, look at kind of pre-pandemic, some of the long-term trends that have been happening in the economy and society. So things like an aging population, some challenges with our social safety net, and then look at those in conjunction with what has been happening during the pandemic. So some of those trends have accelerated, some of them maybe have kind of flattened out a little bit, maybe some of them have reversed in some ways and made things a little bit look a little bit different coming out of the pandemic. So that's really what we looked at, is what are those kind of key trends and drivers of change in the country. What do they mean in terms of key kind of characteristics of our policy environment? And you mentioned one. So one of the ones we identified was declining trust. So certain of those long-term drivers contributing to declining trust, others contributing to an increasingly complex policy environment where there's a lot of big structural issues that are interplaying with each other and making it really tricky for policymakers to figure out what even to do about something. And then the third kind of key characteristic of the policy environment in today's world is growing uncertainty. So we're kind of not sure what the future looks like in a lot of ways, and that makes it also really tricky and challenging for policymakers to kind of develop policies, especially long-term policies, right? Like if we're kind of making infrastructure investments, for example, like light rail or subways or what have you, are those actually going to be as necessary in a world where maybe everybody's in an electric self-driving car and that increases throughput on our roads and we don't need transit as much and people kind of prefer a different mode of transportation, or remote work really takes off and takes hold and far fewer people are traveling to our downtown cores where transit is typically focused. So some of those are some of the kind of issues we wanted to identify, and really the report wraps up with some innovative, interesting approaches to public administration that policymakers might want to deploy in this environment. So, what are some of the best practices from both Canada and around the world that might help cut through the complexity and uncertainty policymakers are facing? So, new approaches to collaboration, engagement, new approaches to measuring successive programs, those types of things. So, yeah, it's really kind of what we're hoping is kind of a fairly light, easy read for people where they can kind of flip through it. They can kind of jump to different sections that they might be interested in, kind of come back to periodically for inspiration and kind of some thought-provoking reflections on what they're working on in their own kind of corner of the public sector.
So yeah, I downloaded this, and actually, not being a policy person myself, I was kind of worried about getting in the middle of you and Thomas here, who are both very policy oriented. So I took a read of this, and it's actually, like you said, very light and easy to read. And like you mentioned, the three categories, and Thomas in the outline has identified them, just like you said, number one being declining trust. And that one was interesting to me too, because as you watch social media, as you watch the news, as you listen to how people talk, they have a growing distrust of government, of media, even each other to an extent. Why do you see this happening? And like, what's the outcome?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of factors that are playing into this for Canadians, and I mean the statistics, kind of when you poll people on what their views of trust are pretty alarming. I mean, you mentioned the Edelman Trust Index, which is a really good resource for this. But there was a study conducted last summer where people were asked, "Do you trust official government accounts of events?" And about half of people said no. So I mean, that kind of is a shocking figure to me, that half of the people you see around you kind of on a day-to-day basis don't trust what the government is telling them. And obviously there's kind of political factors playing into that. Political parties are kind of amplifying some of this. You've got misinformation, disinformation, that makes it harder for people in a social media kind of digital age to know what's true and what's not true. And they kind of can be told things that they later find out aren't true. And then that makes them maybe distrust any information that they're seeing, even if it is from a source that typically they would have trusted before. But there are also some societal pieces that play into this. I mean, if we think about the issue like income inequality and financial insecurity, I mean, income inequality levels in Canada are at or near all-time highs. And we know inflation levels have been rampant over the past year plus. Home ownership is increasingly unaffordable. I mean, if you live in Toronto or Vancouver, you're paying over 85% of your household income on for the median household towards mortgage carrying costs and home ownership costs. So, I mean, that's a staggering figure. I mean, it's like, well, how do you have anything left to kind of buy food or do anything if you spent 85-90% of your income on your shelter costs? And then if we think about things like the social safety net, so I mean, programs like employment insurance are originally designed to be there for people if they're laid off and are out of work for a period of time. But we know far fewer people who are unemployed are actually eligible for EI. So the number is kind of like at 40-ish% now. Back in the early 80s, that was over 80% of people who were unemployed were eligible for EI. So all of this kind of leads to a point where you've got people kind of feeling less certain about their place in the world, kind of being told by government sometimes, like, hey, the economy is growing at 3% a year, we're doing well, everybody's employed. But how does that translate for a lot of people? It doesn't translate to them feeling like they're doing better than they were 5 or 10 years ago. Like they look at all their bills, their grocery bills, utility bills, like everything is costing more. And for a lot of folks, especially in kind of the bottom half of the income distribution, like they're not making any more money than they were 5, 10 years ago. So you can imagine they're kind of not super happy being told that things are going well when they know from their lived experience that things aren't going so well for them.
Yeah, you can't really blame them. And yeah, like you said, if you're being told that everything's going well and nothing is, like, and that's the thing, like everybody's bills are going up and their pay is not following it. You're expected to pay for a lot more. The social safety nets, like you said, even for social safety nets, you can look at healthcare as well. And with what the pandemic did to our health system, especially in Ontario, people would be very uneasy about going anywhere near a hospital with anything serious.
Yeah, that's one of the other kind of drivers of change we looked at in that bucket of the trust issue was healthcare system vulnerabilities. And as you said, like, I mean, kind of it's front and center for everybody. If you pick up the newspaper or listen to the radio, that such and such emergency department is closed for the weekend, or you're looking at a 20-hour wait for an ER visit, and people struggling to find family doctors. And I mean, obviously the healthcare system was incredibly stressed and strained, if not kind of semi-broken during the pandemic. And so many nurses and doctors, for very understandable reasons, decided, like, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to step away from this profession. So I mean, that's putting a lot of pressure on those workers who remain in the healthcare system. Our population is aging as well. So I mean, the healthcare system's not going to decline in importance going forward. Like, it's going to become even more central and critical to people's lives. So how can we rebuild the healthcare system in a way that delivers the results people want? It's effective, it's on time, but also doesn't consume like all of our provincial healthcare, or all of our provincial budget, I should say. I mean, right now healthcare is, I don't even recall the latest figures, probably like 45% of the budget is towards healthcare, but it's like you're looking at that going to 60, 70, 80% if we don't kind of do something to figure out more efficient ways of delivering services.
The other thing too is with aging, we've also got a growing population with the federal government wanting to get up to 500,000 new Canadians.
Yeah, so I mean, we're in a spot where we have an aging population on the one hand, and at the same time, the federal government has made a policy commitment to look to allow 500,000-ish people into the country. So immigrants, a combination of immigrants and refugees, like mostly on the immigration side, obviously, which is great. I mean, we're a country of immigrants. We want to welcome people from all over the world. But I think people rightly have questions about, we're struggling already with housing affordability and like rental prices in pretty much every community in Ontario and across the country. Like, where are these people going to stay, and what are they, and kind of, how is that not going to hurt my rental and mortgage costs?
And back onto the healthcare thing, you got to think of the initial hit too. I mean, we've been paying, like, Canadians who've been here for a while have been paying into the system for a long time to support everybody using it. And then you've got another 500,000 coming in who haven't yet paid into it, but will, that may need to use the system. And I mean, like you said, it's strained as it is now with people paying into it for 10 years, 5 years, what have you. And then you've got 500,000, and say maybe even 10% of those need to use the healthcare system as soon as they get here. That's 50,000 more people that are hitting the healthcare system without actually...
That pressure on services is across the board. So it's housing, it's healthcare, it's social services. And again, like, it's a good thing that we're welcoming people in. We want to get more talent and more hardworking, skilled people, but we need to have the infrastructure. When I say infrastructure, I don't mean like roads and bridges necessarily, but like the social infrastructure to accommodate people.
But so Sunil, I was going to say, but actually, like, for our members, we're a road infrastructure kind of organization, and that is part of it. I mean, the provincial government's been talking about building 1.5 million new homes, and you can't do that without like hard infrastructure. You need to have the sewer systems, the water systems, roads, bridges, all this kind of stuff. And municipalities already have trouble paying for the existing infrastructure that is there, let alone helping building new ones. And then you have policies like Bill 23, which many of our members have, I think, been identified as something that's going to really kneecap them, handicap them going forward in building some of that infrastructure that is required. But yeah, it's these are complex issues, I guess, and the report mentioned increased complexity, but we have these very complex issues, and then on the other side, you have people looking for kind of simplistic solutions as well, which isn't always productive in the policy, I guess, environment here. We're trying to come up with good ideas to kind of address these topics, especially when they're really kind of just broken down to a simplistic. This is good. This is bad. You can't support this. You have to support this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and you mentioned Bill 23. So, I mean, that's a good example
Yeah.
of kind of like with good intentions. I think the provincial government has said, like, look, we need to build these homes faster. We committed to building 1.5 million homes over a 10-year period. We already have labor shortages in the construction sector. How are we going to do that? Like, let's expedite the process. Let's kind of cut out some of the red tape at the municipal level. So, I mean, that all sounds good and is kind of probably in theory a good idea. But when it comes to things like freezing or eliminating development charges that fund the infrastructure that we need to service those new homes, that's a problem because that's a big source of revenue for municipalities. And if they're not able to tap into that development charge revenue anymore for certain types of new builds, where are they going to get the money from? I mean, are they raising property taxes? Is the province going to provide them a transfer to accommodate for that lost revenue? So kind of like what seems like a simple fix, then it basically poses like 10 more questions. And then each of those questions, once you address one of those, 10 more questions pop up. So that's really kind of the nature of the policy environment we're in, where any one decision by any one level of government has knock-on effects for other levels of government, other departments or agencies within the same level of government, like hard infrastructure like roads and bridges, aren't disconnected from social services or schools or healthcare anymore. I mean, not that they ever really were, but like all those things are connected much more now than ever before. So again, like everybody's trying their best. I mean, all levels of government want to kind of make things better for their citizens, their residents, their taxpayers. But when it's kind of like a Jenga tower, right? Like we're kind of in a pretty precarious state. If you pull one block out and we don't have an unlimited number of blocks. If you think of the blocks as the money. So we want to move one block from here and move it over there. It's like the whole system could kind of fall down at any point now. So it's really kind of like, how do you plan? How do you think about these things? But you have to do it quickly too, right? I mean, the new people are coming into the country. People are demanding better housing options. You can't wait 5 years and say, we'll think about it. Like you got to start putting shovels in the ground and do something now. So kind of how do we anticipate? How do we plan for those programs and investments in a smarter way?
And that complexity, I think, ties back to the declining trust because you've got such complex issues, like Thomas said, and everybody's looking for that quick solution, that simple solution. But like it says, it's complex. It's not black or white. And that, I guess that brings in frustration for people who can't understand what's going on or why it's happening. And that leads to distrust towards institutions.
Well, exactly. I mean, the trust and complexity issues and the uncertainty issue, like they're intertwined, right? So, I mean, if I'm already somebody who's like, I'm not sure I trust governments to deliver the things I need them to deliver for me. And then the government a government, provincial, federal, municipal, whomever on the other side of an issue, like, hey, we want to fix something, but they get it wrong somehow, or it doesn't quite land how it should have because they hadn't anticipated something or the funding didn't come through or what have you. That person is going to think, oh my gosh, here we go again. Like they've screwed something else up. Like I'm going to trust them even less than I already did. So it's kind of like governments are kind of shooting arrows at a bullseye, but the bullseye is like moving around and it's shaky and the wind is blowing it around. So it's like they're trying to hit targets that are really difficult to hit. And every time they miss the target, people trust level goes down that they're going to hit the target the next time. Right. So it's kind of like this self-fulfilling kind of negative feedback.
And then you've got people playing Monday morning quarterback saying, well, I would have done this, I would have done that. And like hindsight's 2020, woulda, coulda, shoulda, but like,
well, that's the thing. I mean, and it's the job of opposition parties and the media to kind of hold governments to account, and like they should be kind of critiquing government for things. But I mean, unfortunately, that does lead to just kind of like bad headlines, and what that
Yeah.
what that really leads to is a really a fear of innovation and trying new things, because like, well, if we try something new, it might go badly, and then that's going to be negative headlines. That's going to hurt us at the ballot box in the next election. Much safer to do what we're already doing, maybe some incremental tweaks. But the problem is, in a lot of areas we're talking about here, incremental is not good enough anymore. Like, we need those big transformational swings and efforts. But a lot of the kind of incentive structure in our system right now holds that against people. Or if you take a big swing and you miss, like, you're not going to get praised for trying something. You're going to get criticized in the newspaper, on the radio, and by opposition parties for wasting public money or screwing something up.
Yeah, a lot of our members definitely will understand that. I mean, they're in the municipal government. It's not different from the province and the federal government, where there's a bit of risk. They're risk averse for that reason, and sometimes, unfortunately, that has the opposite effect of you don't want to waste public money, but by not trying anything new, you get stuck in old ways of doing things, and that ends up costing more in some ways because there's no innovation. In government there. So yeah, definitely something our members would be very familiar with.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, a lot of the things that we do in Canada from at the government level, like, there are things we've been doing for 30, 40, 50 plus years. And hey, that's okay. Like, it's delivering some results, but like, there are new ways of trying to deliver services. And like, a good example is like digitization of public services. Like, there are so many services at all levels of government that could and should be digitized and integrated. I mean, if I, the taxpayer, don't really care if I'm kind of accessing a federal, provincial, or municipal service, like, I need a driver's license or I need a passport. Like, I just want to go on a site and get that stuff. And I don't have to like have 5 different passwords and like prove my identification 20 times. And we know in countries like Estonia, it's like, I mean, it's a smaller country, albeit, but like, you can do pretty much everything online there. Like, you can vote online, you can sign contracts online, your taxes are pre-populated for you. In a country like Denmark, their digital services are so good, they actually had to slow down the ability to get divorced online. So a couple might get into a fight on a Friday, and then their system was so fast, you could literally log in and say, I want a divorce like Friday night, and it was done. So they had to put in like a delay period where it's like, they come back to you kind of a week or two later and say, are you sure you want to go ahead with that divorce? And like 90% of the time, it's kind of blown over, and the couples, it was like a spat, and you're over it. But I mean, we're nowhere close to that. I mean, probably good on the divorce side in Canada, but like, there's a lot of services we have where it's like, I had to go get my passport renewed a couple months ago, and like, this was after the huge delays that were happening last year. But still, like, get there early, wait for a couple hours, touch and go whether it would arrive in time before my flight left on the Saturday. Got it, like, was there Friday at like noon. Finally, it came through. It was like, oh, thank God, I can go on my trip with my kids. But like, that's a good example. Like, that theoretically is something that's like, we should be able to log in, click, it's done. You've got a secure digital identity. They know I'm not kind of pretending to be somebody else, and I get mailed my passport in a secure fashion. Don't have to line up. Don't have to kind of prove my identity 20 different ways to Sunday. Get my neighbor to sign that he knows who I am. So lots of kind of low-hanging fruit in that area.
The
just
problem
for one
with that,
example,
though, and I see people's distrust in that sense, is that the government's tried to digitize things in the past and they've messed it up so bad.
Well, that's an issue. Like, the Phoenix pay system is kind of a big example at the federal
right where
level.
I was going to go. Yeah.
But I would say, like, that's because a couple of initiatives haven't gone well is not a reason to not move forward. Like, we know we have to digitize government services. Like, the lesson there should be, let's figure out who the right partners are to work with. Let's figure out like how to do this in a kind of scalable way where it's not like one big bang of we're transforming the whole federal pay system with like 10 million different rules for different pay stubs at
but
once.
I mean, if you think of something just as simple as the ArriveCan app and how much of a mess that was, I mean, like, I would be hard pressed to trust the federal government with anything digital after that.
Well, you're making our distrust point here, here, Jared.
I
But
mean,
you're
they're helping me. I mean, with
yeah. So
something that they spent so much money on and don't know where half of it went, like that's. I understand why people distrust it, and I mean, I come from a digital background, so I see things like that, and I'm like, listen, this shouldn't have been this difficult, and it should have worked, and it shouldn't have put how many people in quarantine that shouldn't have been.
yeah, yeah. I mean,
Like that
it's
that was a
again,
simple problem that they just couldn't figure out, and you're like, well, why would I have them like put my passport out there when it's not secure, and now I've got somebody from God knows where running around as me with my passport.
yeah. I mean, if that happened, I guess I'd hope somebody's running around with me and my passport, and they have to pay all my bills. But I guess that's not usually how it
No, that's not
works.
how that works.
But
They
but
find the
yeah, I
real
mean,
you and make you pay.
it goes back to the point that like because some things haven't worked well or weren't executed well is not a reason that we stop. Like we can't just say, okay, well, some digital transformations haven't worked well, therefore we're never going to digitize
No, and
our
I'm not saying that.
services. But it's definitely kind of yeah, you're absolutely right. Like we need to learn lessons from other countries,
Yeah.
initiatives that have gone well in Canada. Like some online services at some levels of government are quite good now. I
Well,
mean,
and that's the thing. Like, if the Liberals had come out and said, okay, now we're going to look at what Estonia did with their passports and we're going to try and emulate that, I'd be like, okay, there's a proven method as opposed to we're
yeah,
going to spend, I don't know, what, $50 million on this app that doesn't actually work.
yeah, and that's I mean that's an issue, right? I mean everybody likes to come up with their own solution because then they can
Yeah.
say like, "Hey, we developed this and built this." That sounds better than saying we just borrowed something another country or another province or
But
another
if it's,
city
yeah, if it
did. But
works,
like,
why?
yeah, like we're in an environment where we don't have the money to make big
Yeah.
mistakes anymore. I mean, not that we ever did, but we really need to borrow and kind of adapt best practices from uh, governments that have figured this out. And like,
And we finished a podcast last week with Brent Todderin about
yeah,
looking at other communities and what they're doing to make themselves better and bringing them back to your community. And that's like, yeah, why reinvent the wheel?
well, exactly. That's it. And in policymaking, generally, like we don't like to reinvent the wheel. Like, we like
Yeah.
to look at like what has Australia done, what's the UK
Yeah.
done, like what's America done on some of these issues. So I mean, it's not a new that's not a new phenomenon. Like we just need to kind of double down on that. Like, and I mean, the
Right.
issue is sometimes like it's hard to borrow something from a different context and put it into a Canadian system where it's like we're
Yeah.
heavily decentralized. The federal government only has so much kind of say in certain issues. Municipalities are creatures of the province. They don't necessarily have the funding to deliver some of these things. Like in some of these countries we're talking about, it's like they're unitary states or like they have very strong central governments, and it's much easier for them to kind of push through these initiatives. So, I mean, that's great on that hand. I mean,
Yeah.
the other side of the coin would be people would say, well, in Canada at the provincial level, because provinces have a good deal of autonomy, like they can experiment and they can innovate. And like Quebec's childcare program introduced 20,
Yeah.
30 years ago has proven to be a good model for the federal program now. And we tried that out. I mean, Quebec tried that out and kind of piloted that in their province. And now the rest of the country is kind of coming on board. So I mean, there are pros and cons to our system. I mean, there's no perfect system of government, but I mean, certainly I would say like on the digital front, particularly like that, it is tricky when you've got three levels of government who all hold different sources of data and all have to agree on how they share that data and information. Like I know from my own
Yeah.
experience, like even within the provincial government 10 years ago, like we were having a hard time getting different ministries within the province to share information and data with each other, let alone sharing with like the federal or municipal governments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But no, completely agree with you. Digital is definitely the way to go. You just got to do it the right way because there is a lot of danger there, especially with personal information and the way the internet
Yeah.
works. But like digital driver's license would be fantastic. You'd never forget about leaving your wallet at home and, oh my God, I don't have my license on me and that cop's pulling me over type deal.
Yeah,
So yeah, no.
I mean, governments are not just kind of meeting citizen expectations in a vacuum. It's like if I can do my banking with a really useful app, or I can order an Uber with a great app, like people expect that they should be able to access their government services in the
Right.
same way. So, I mean, that also kind of ties into that trust piece. Like, well, if my bank can do this and my insurance company can do this, like why can't my government do the same thing and kind of develop an app that I can just log into and get that driver's license renewal or
Yeah.
get that health card
Yeah.
Because,
renewal.
like you said, banks have a little bit more autonomy.
Yeah, and they can try things and they can kind
Yeah.
of skunk work things, and they're not going to be on the front page of the Globe and Mail if they develop an app that doesn't go well.
Exactly.
Whereas if you're a government, that is the risk you run.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, why don't we shift gears here a little bit? We mentioned at the start growing uncertainty, and in the report, there's kind of a few drivers here that were mentioned, which is one was climate change, the second was economic shifts, and the third was multipolar global politics. Why don't we talk a bit about those? Why don't we start with climate change? As a millennial, climate change is probably this biggest like existential crisis. It's always kind of like lingering behind me or behind us, kind of, you feel it all the time. It affects decisions, and you want to have a family, where do you want to buy a house, all these sorts of things. Talk to us about what you saw when you talked about climate change in your report.
Well, and especially in a municipal context too, with
Yes.
the growing amount of storms and just torrential downpours destroying infrastructure too. Like our municipalities have to fix these roads, these buildings, these bridges that are just getting battered by storms and like once in a century hurricanes that just happen to blow through this area. Like that's yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, climate change is just raising the uncertainty cone, right? Like we kind of we don't know what's around the corner from a weather event point of view anymore. Like, is it going to be an unseasonably hot winter and warm winter, and everybody's kind of happy with that in Canada, or are we going to have a massive amount of torrential downpours in certain parts of the country that are going to wash away bridges and roads and pose real financial challenges for municipalities? So, I mean, that's the issue here with climate change is like we just don't know. We don't know what the impacts are going to be specifically in a particular region or locality in a particular year. But then we also have a lot of policy uncertainty. Like, what are our federal, provincial, and municipal governments going to do to plan for climate change and adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change? So, like, how are we going to start transitioning some of our economic sectors to becoming low or no carbon going
Right.
forward? What does it mean for? I mean, we mentioned electric vehicles off the top. Like we've got a zero emission vehicle mandate coming into place in the next 12, 13 years by 2035, I think it is. So, I mean, what does that mean for consumer decisions? What does that mean for vehicles? In terms of charging infrastructure, what does that mean for how people get around? Are they going to use public transit? Are they going to jump into electric cars that drive themselves and are cheaper than transit? So just so many questions here for citizens, for governments, like kind of across the board. So climate change is just a great example of this huge kind of this huge trend exerting a lot of pressure on all of our systems, and we're not really sure which way it's going to go or how quickly we can adapt or mitigate those impacts. And then, I mean, you mentioned, Thomas, a couple of the other points. I mean, economic shifts. I mean, we know that our economic growth rates are probably going to be about half what they were over the next 50 years as compared to the last 50 years. We know we've got challenges with productivity and innovation. So if we're not generating economic growth, I mean, that sounds bad in a vacuum, but it has real impacts on like how are we funding healthcare? How are we building housing? How are we building transit? How are we providing social services? So, I mean, it kind of just underlines that need to be like efficient, innovative, try new things. We're going to have to do more with less in all likelihood. And then the third one, I mean, we got into briefly in the report. I mean, there's probably most uncertainty about this, but like, is the U.S. going to continue to remain the world's kind of sole superpower? What does China's ascendancy mean in that context? Is the EU going to kind of step up into a bit of a vacuum? So kind of, we've obviously historically had a great trading relationship and political partnership with the United States. Can we just assume that's going to continue? Should we be diversifying our trade efforts and our relationships in other parts of the world? Again, a lot of uncertainty there. Like we're just kind of not sure what direction that's heading and what role Canada should kind of assume in that unsettled global environment.
Okay. And Sunil, the report discusses some of the consequences that all these drivers of change that we've kind of discussed here that they'll have on public policy. I mean, I think we kind of even delved into some of these consequences. But is there anything you want to kind of highlight just after everything we talked about there?
Yeah, I mean, it really just kind of boils down to like we need to start thinking about how we can develop policy that puts more weight on long-term considerations, equity issues. How can we tackle problems more collaboratively? How can we respond to issues more quickly so that when something happens, it doesn't take us a year and a half to develop a regulatory framework or a policy response? How do we get much better at using data and evaluation capacity? So, I mean, we kind of touched on this with the digital conversation, but I mean, in an ideal world, our government services would be responding in real time to information that comes in. So if we know that something's not working, we can adjust it on the fly and tailor our responses to a particular issue. So I mean, those are some of the kind of high level impacts of how these three characteristics combine to both put pressure and provide opportunity to governments, I would say. I mean, I don't want this to kind of be a purely negative conversation. Like, there's lots of opportunity to do better here, and we know it can be done. And we've got lots of kind of great examples of success both in Canada and abroad that we can model. And the report really wraps up with what some of those innovative approaches are. So we kind of catalog pretty comprehensively, like things like new approaches to engagement. So how do we make sure we're engaging citizens on issues in a way that makes sense? So like Belgium has a really interesting model of like citizens assembly. So they'll pick a random panel of people from a community and say, you're now going to become over the next 18 months our experts on child welfare reform. And you're going to study it, you're going to research it, and you're going to provide advice back to the government on what to do. And the reason that helps rebuild trust is because now you, Thomas, or Jared, you're not kind of saying, oh, those fat cats in the capital are not listening to me. It's like, hey, that's my neighbor who's on that panel. Like, I know he's a good guy or she's a good person. I trust what they're going to put forward as recommendations. Like, I know they're not in the pocket of kind of big corporations or special interest groups. So we've done similar things in Ontario. We did a similar thing I worked on like 15 years ago with electoral reform. So we had a citizens assembly on electoral reform where I think it was 108, 110 random citizens were sent a letter. Do you want to become a key advisor to the government and the people of Ontario on what our new electoral system could be? So they get together every month, learn from the best, and by the end of that year and a half, like they were some of the leading experts in Canada on what electoral systems were. So that's one example. I mean, I know we're kind of running out of time, but probably a second quick example I'll point to is how we could leverage behavioral insights. So like this idea of nudge thinking. So if we understand how people think, we can shape how they behave. So I mean, a simple example at the municipal level, if we want people to use less water during the summer because it's putting a stress on municipal water systems, there's some really interesting research that shows if you just get some summer students, high school, university, get them to knock on people's doors and say, will you commit to me that you're going to use less water this year during the heat, or you're going to use your sprinkler like late at night, not during the sunny day when it's kind of all just getting burned off by the sun? Making that interpersonal commitment to somebody shows a dramatic increase in the likelihood that somebody will actually follow through with that commitment. I mean, a similar example is like when we think about like tax repayment. If you get a letter from CRA that says, Thomas, you haven't paid your taxes, you got to pay your taxes on time, sometimes people will just ignore that. But if I send you the same letter and I say, Thomas, you got to pay your taxes, and did you know 98% of the people in your neighborhood have already paid their taxes on time? That social conformity and pressure shows that you'll have a much more likely uptake of kind of paying back your taxes compared to somebody who received the just generic pay your taxes on time letter. So very small kind of clever tweaks and nudges to how we present choices and options to people can really drive uptake. So those are kind of some of the smart approaches we look at in the report that we might want to think about deploying more broadly in Canada.
And it seems to be taking the trust issue away from the government, which, again, people, it doesn't matter who's in power, are always going to have a negative view of, and putting it into their social circles and people around them, so to people they trust more to make a proper decision.
Yeah, like how do we leverage those community organizations or individuals in your own network that you trust more, and like how can they help get us to better public policy outcomes? So I mean, that's something I think governments are going to have to get much better at, is like that partnership with community organizations on the ground who know people and like, hey, they can deliver this message and these services on our behalf, and we're just going to kind of provide them the funding and the framework. And obviously, we do that in lots of spaces already, but that might become an increasingly important approach rather than kind of more direct service delivery by governments.
And lets people feel like they've been heard and that their
Yeah,
opinion does matter.
exactly. Like, what if you're engaged and you feel people are listening to you, it's much more likely you're going to participate in a program or trust the delivery of that program. And that's the path we really want to get on, is where people feel like they're being heard, they're getting the services and programs that they need, and they're being delivered efficiently by the responsible level of government, whether that's municipal, provincial, or federal, or some combination of the three in partnership.
Okay. So when people click on this this report in the comments down below, what should the municipal sector be taking away from it?
I really think most of the lessons from the report apply equally to all levels of government. I mean, I think if anything, in some cases more so for municipal leaders and policymakers, because they're delivering some of the most visible services to Canadians. Like if somebody's garbage isn't picked up or their water's not coming through the pipes, they're going to pick up the phone and call somebody right away. Whereas if the EI system structurally isn't super sound, like you're only going to notice that if you're unemployed and you're not getting your payment on time. Like the average person doesn't think about that on a day-to-day basis. So I think for municipal policymakers, most of the report should resonate in terms of like, here are some approaches they might want to think about to deliver services differently, engage more fruitfully with their citizens and residents, and evaluate what they're doing more effectively too. I mean, that's a big piece of this puzzle that we haven't talked too much about. But if we're not evaluating what works and what doesn't work and adjusting, that's a big problem, especially in a really constrained fiscal environment. So how do we kind of get that data and evaluation capacity up to a point where, hey, we thought this might work, it's not, we're going to adjust it or we're going to scrap it and go in a different direction. And there's nothing wrong with that. We should really be encouraging that.
Definitely. All right. Do you have any other questions, Thomas, before we?
No, I think that pretty much sums it all up, Jared.
Okay, terrific. Before we wrap, though, I just want to give you a few minutes, Sunil. Is there anything you want to leave our listeners with before you present at the Good Roads Conference in a couple of weeks?
No, I mean, this has been a great conversation. I think we've pretty comprehensively covered everything. So, I mean, kind of as we said at the outset, like, please feel free to check out the CSA Public Policy Center website. We've got not just this navigating complexity report up, but reports on affordable housing, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, circular economy, remote work, and more reports to come in the coming months. So we'll have one on accessibility, one on regulating digital technology, healthcare system. So kind of you name it. If it's a pressing topic that you're interested in, odds are we'll have a paper looking at it in the next year or so.
Excellent. All right. That sounds fantastic. And for those listening, if you want to hear more from Sunil, hear him elaborate more on this, be sure to be at the conference this year. At this time, I think pre-registration's closed, but you can still register on site at the Fairmont Royal York Hotel on April 16th in Toronto. For those who have already registered, remember to download the conference app from the Apple Store or the Google Play Store. Take a look at all of the exciting speakers and events that will be taking place over the 4 days of the conference. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram for up-to-date information on everything happening on Good Roads. And if you're watching this on YouTube, remember, like we said earlier, smash that like button, subscribe. It's not just the podcast that goes up here, but we offer tons of great content to help you run your municipality as efficiently as possible. Also, leave us a comment, give us your feedback. We'd love to hear from you. If you have questions for Sunil, leave them down there. We'll be sure to get them over to him. And until the conference, everybody, take it easy.